ጤና ይስጥልኝ ተከበራችሁ ተመልካቾቻችን ይህ በዲያስፖራ ቴሌቪዥን የተዘጋጀ የሚቀርብላችሁ የጌራ ሾው ፕሮግራም ነው። ዛሬም እንደተለመደው የጌራ ሾው ፕሮግራማችንን ጀምረናል። ዛሬ ይዤላችሁ የመጣሁት እንግዳዬ አቶ ጀማል ካውንተስ ይባላል። ጋዜጠኛና ፎቶግራፈር ነው። በቅርቡ ወደ ኢትዮጵያ ጉዞ አድርጎ ነበር። በኢትዮጵያ የነበረውን ቆይታና ወቅታዊ ሁኔታዎች ላይ እንነጋገራለን። አብራችሁ እንድትቆዩ በአክብሮት የጋበዝኩኝ። አሁንም በእናንተ በተከበራችሁ ተመልካቾቼ ስምና እንዲሁም በዲያስፖራ ቴሌቪዥን ስራ ባልደረቦቼ ስም አቶ ጀማል ጥሪያችንን አክብሮ ወደ ጌራ ሾው ቪያ ዙም ብቅ ስላለልን ከልብ እያመሰገንኩ አብራችሁ እንድትቆዩ ጋብዛለሁ። ፕሮግራማችን የሚሆነው በእንግሊዝኛ ነው። Hello, thanks for watching the Gera Show. Today my guest is Mr. Jamal Countess. He's a journalist and a photographer, and we will be discussing about his recent trip to Ethiopia and the current situation. Please stay with us. Hello, Mr. Jamal. Thank you for appearing on the Gera Show live program.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, Mr. Jamal, please tell us about your recent trip that you did to Ethiopia and the reason for that, please.
Okay, this last trip was just under a month. I got back to the States about 2 weeks ago, and that trip was principally to review and expose the conditions in which IDPs, or internally displaced people from the Amhara region, were living under. So I went to the Zanzalima IDP camp just outside of Bahar Dar. I went to Enebet, which is about another hour and a half outside of Bahar Dar. I went to Dabark. I went to the Chena massacre site, and then I turned and went to Desi and Kambolcha.
With whom did you travel?
I basically have a network of doctors and humanitarians that I travel with, and I have had them in place for a while, just people that I trust. It's a small, tight network. Of course, you have to get all the government permissions, so you have to go through the broadcast ministry. Then you also have to go through the Amhara regional government. So I went through all the necessary channels that journalists have to go through, and then I just picked up with my team from where I left off. This is my 4th trip to Ethiopia since this conflict started, and I have a process by which I do my coverage, dual in terms as well as translators on the ground here in the States who review my recorded material before I publish or post anything.
Okay. As you know, currently the rebels group are trying to give the world the impression that all this occupation of these towns or cities are peaceful. What have you noticed in your stay in Ethiopia? Please take us there.
What I've noticed is just approaching or dealing with different small populations of the over 1 million IDPs in the Amhara region in North Gondar, all the way through over to Desi and Kambolcha. Desi itself, before the attack, had over 300,000 IDPs alone, and that's not including what was in or who was in Kambolcha. It's infuriating to me because I have been shooting for 30 years, and a lot of these organizations that are conveying a lot of this false information, I have had contracts with, I've worked for, and I've been deeply disappointed that people have been let down and misled, because there's nothing peaceful about the occupations that have been occurring in terms of the towns that the TPLF has occupied. It's been large death tolls, it's been rape, it's been pillaging. Lalibela, for instance, and I was actually talking with one of the IDPs that I was helping in Lalibela, who is now in Addis Ababa, seeking medical treatment for her daughter. Lalibela was basically pillaged. The churches were at one time in grave danger because of the placement of artillery on church grounds. And for those of us that have been to Lalibela, have been to Medhani Elam in the northern group, been to Gurgis, and been to basically all of these churches, they're tight spaces. So you can't hide mortars on church grounds without any type of reprisal, basically destroying the churches. So the one thing I will say is that through my interviews with the IDPs from Lalibela, is that the priest made all the difference. The priest stood in front of the churches, they fought for the churches, they pressured the TPLF to relocate their heavy artillery and mortars to areas just outside of the church grounds. But nonetheless, there has been no peace and calm in any of these towns that the TPLF have occupied.
Where did you travel first? Let me hear that again. And have you witnessed any?
On this particular trip or on my first trip?
No, on this particular trip.
On this particular trip, so I started off in Bahar Dar, and Bahar Dar has actually become an IDP camp. So there's Zanzalima, which is a shopping mall or industrial area that was repurposed to become home to over 5,000 IDPs. And that's just outside of town. Within Bahar Dar itself, there are pockets of IDPs, mainly from Lalibela, who are either renting pensions in large numbers or finding anywhere they can afford to stay and staying there. From there, I went to a town called Enebet. Please forgive me if my pronunciation is off. Okay. And that's where I encountered the teenage conscripts, the 10-year-olds and 10 to 16-year-olds who left Sokoto because they did not want to be taken to be basically human shields for the TPLF. And these are Amhara children. So from Enebet, we went to Dabat, then to Chena, and then to Debark before I turned to go east to, what would I say, to Kombolcha and Dese.
So from Debark, you traveled to Kombolcha and Dese?
Yes, yes.
What have you noticed or observed in Kombolcha and Dese?
Kombolcha was probably one of the most moving experiences for me because the IDP camp that I went to that was at a primary school was predominantly Muslim individuals and families who had come from Hebrew. Yeah. And, you know, incredible humanity on display.
I lost you. Are you still there?
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I do hear you. Go ahead, continue.
Okay. Yes. So stories of coming from these women who had their husbands they had left behind because their husbands were fighting for their towns, and these women were here in the IDP camps. They were here in special rooms for expecting mothers and nursing mothers, sometimes up to 38 in a room, who still found it in their hearts to want to share food, to make a meal for me, have me sit and spend time and hear their stories. Desi, on the other hand, some of the same things. A lot of people were from Raya, and they had been there for long periods of time, but there were also pockets of young men in the camps who were unnecessarily hostile. And because I had gotten the intelligence beforehand that the camps, the IDP camps, and even in Zanzalima now, I'm getting reports of intimidation. The IDP camps had been infiltrated by TPLF, and they were intimidating the people in these camps, threatening them, threatening their families back in Raya or back in regions that they controlled, saying that they would basically see death if they cooperated or talked or anything of that nature. So the first IDP camp in Desi that I went to, I had given my team notice. I said, I basically gave them a crash course in interaction. The camera doesn't come out until everybody is okay with me being here, and the camp officials do their best to speak to individuals to make sure they're okay with being interviewed and talked to. And so my team and I, we went into this camp, and I just watched a couple of pockets of guys just kind of immediately come in, and without even seeing the camera, began to overtalk the camp administrator and kind of push aside anybody who wanted to find out why we were there or who wanted to engage with us. So I pulled them out immediately. And I should have photographed some of these individuals because they probably would be people of interest in these camps. But it was very suspicious. I mean, well, it wasn't suspicious for me, but it was very blatant. So I moved on to another IDP camp where we implemented the protocol that I had given to my team. And that's where I made a complete set of photos in the time that I was there. It was actually at another primary school.
So I read an article that was written by one of your best friend, of course, Mr. Jeff Pierce. With your permission, he noted something that about the 13-year-old girl that was raped with the rebel groups. Have you got a chance to talk to her?
No, she is in Bargina. The town is rough. The name of the town is rough in my head, but basically I haven't talked to her. I've talked to her family. Because for somehow people have been able to still leave Lalibela. People have been able to communicate with loved ones in Lalibela. A few people, not a lot of people, but a few people. But we just know that she is basically suffering from PTSD. She hasn't had any type of psychological or medical treatment for rape. So she's still there, basically. And it was a very violent rape. She basically lost her virginity to a TPLF soldier or multiple. And it was just, it's ridiculous, to be honest with you. But in talking to her family friends that had escaped to Bahar Dar, they are enduring their own sets of trials and tribulations in response to this situation and as a result of this invasion of Lalibela.
Well, the father of two daughters, is very disturbing what we hear and see there. And overall, how their day-to-day life looks like in these TDP camps for these people?
Well, it's different sets of problems for different camps, right? So because Bahar Dar is hotter, more humid, the IDP camps or at least at Zanzalima, and actually I found some throughout the town, was dealing with the presence of the Nairobi fly, which is a beetle which, when crushed or bites, emits kind of like a toxin that's it acts as an acid. So I found a 1-year-old that was suffering from severe exposure to the Nairobi fly. And with her mom's permission, I took her and her mom and her little brother to a local doctor to get treatment. But then I went back to Zanzalima and I advised the camp advisors to inspect all of the buildings. It's a massive complex of maybe like 8 or 9 warehouse-like buildings. And we found the presence of Nairobi fly in several of these buildings, and then subsequently found several individuals who were suffering from these bites. So, you know, the same doctor that I took the child to, he volunteered to come into the camp and basically do free medical care for anybody who was suffering from exposure to the Nairobi fly. And that, in addition to poor sanitation, I mean, a lot of these IDP camps are not geared up to host 100 people, let alone 5,000 people. So they're makeshift camps set up and repurposed from being something else. And so there's a lack of sanitation. There's a lack of privacy. At Zanzalima, I went to the bathrooms that had been built. Basically, a long trench had been built, like a 100-foot trench built or dug out, and like 40 stalls were placed over top of this trench. The problem is there is no free-flowing water. There is no sanitation. It's basically waste material being deposited into a trench, and it's not going anywhere. So you have all type of disease issues and sanitation issues, that health issues that arise from the lack of there being proper sanitation. And this camp is 5,000 strong, with at least 200 arriving every day. And that was when I was there 4 weeks ago. And these stalls don't have doors. So women have to go 2 at a time. One stands in front of the door while the other one uses the bathroom over top of a trench that has no free-flowing plumbing, that basically is standing feces. And it is hot, and, you know, it's humid. So that's one camp. That's Zanzalima. When you get to Enabet, it's in a primary school. Mm-hmm. You have sometimes up to 50 people sleeping in a room. Sanitation is the same sanitation that an elementary or a middle school would have. There are not like 100 bathrooms. There are very few bathrooms, you know? So you're having to deal with people using the bathroom in the bathroom, or trying to find some place outside of the camp to use the bathroom. That creates another set of issues. The shortage of food and the shortage of resources. When I went to Mekelle, when we were allowed to visit Tigray, when it was still under the ENDF, Mekelle had 7 USAID feeding distribution points. And that was not including, I mean, USAID dealt with or worked alongside Catholic Relief Charities and a local Tigrayan support charity as well. But that was 7 feeding schemes or feeding operations within the city of Mekelle alone. And then on the road to Adigrat, my colleagues told me that they just kind of dotted the landscape, that you could see feeding schemes everywhere. Now, when it comes to the Amhara region, local charities, the Orthodox Church, and the diaspora groups are the ones who are primarily feeding and providing care for all of these IDPs. All of the camps that I went to had been serviced by the Amhara emergency funds, who had given out wheat flour and provided bedding, simple mattresses for people to sleep on. I don't know if it was the government being overwhelmed or just being a shortage of resources, but there was not a lot of government action at the time that we were there, that I was there. So lack of resources, lack of plumbing, lack of health options, and, you know, just, I mean, to be quite frank, I mean, I know it may sound like a daunting task, but everybody is experiencing or has some form of PTSD at some level. And the fact that we undervalue the treatment of trauma, even here in the US, is a big problem. So, you know, me personally, I see large scale work that needs to be done to bring healing to these people who have been displaced from their homes under duress, watching loved ones killed, raped and killed while they're being forced away from their homes in the Amhara region and Afar, excuse me.
The doctors you traveled with, are they local?
I was working with a doctor who was part of a diaspora group, part of the Amhara Emergency Fund, but they had a team of local doctors on the ground who were from the Amhara region. So these are local doctors who were well aware with the conditions and who were familiar with the territories that they were working in for the most part. And we had a get together of at least like 12 to 15 doctors before we went into Debark. And they were working in Debark, Chena, Debat, different IDP camps from North Gondar. And then some had come in from Desi Kambolcha. But those who were in Desi Kambolcha basically had their hands full. So they were basically there for the work, you know.
You had a protection when you travel around, or what? Have you experienced any dangerous situation?
I had, when I went to Debark, we had protection. Debark and Chena. When I went to Desi Kambolcha, I had my translators, my driver, and the doctor that were servicing the camps that we went in between. And that was pretty much it. And ironically, that was probably where I needed the protection the most. Previously, when I went to my cadre, I had a full team. When I went to Tigray, I went by myself. Well, I went with God, to be honest with you. And given the tone and the posture of the transitional government and the rate by which they were being assassinated, and the fact that most people knew that I was not going to spew the propaganda that was being fed to the Western journalists, because I lived in Ethiopia and I knew the situation on the ground, and I had a family member by marriage in Mekelle anyway. So I was just kind of familiar with the terrain, a bit more familiar than most of basically all of the Western journalists who've come to Ethiopia in the past year. And I'll just be real about that, be completely frank about that. And then actually on my trip to Chagni, when I was trying to get as close to Beni Shongo Gooms as I could, it's just me and my translator. And we met a team of doctors on the ground at Chagni. So I've had protection throughout some of these trips, but not always. Not physical protection anyway. Yeah.
So your half is from Ethiopia.
Yeah, my wife was a history teacher, a civics teacher in Addis Ababa.
I see.
And she gets a large part of the credit for my education on Walkite and the history, the deep political history of the country since the TPLF came to power, and even beyond that. So my children were born in Ethiopia, both of them. Which brings up another point, because we lived in Arat Kilo when my kids were born, and most of my neighbors were Tigrayan. My landlord was Tigrayan, one of the most beautiful people you could ever meet. The prosecutor and the lawyer who lived across from me were a Tigrayan husband and wife. Solid, upstanding people. I bring that out to say that the forces that try to divide us are playing on these ethnic divisions and trying to feed the Western media narrative of, everybody hates Tigrayans, and this is all about a whole anti-Tigrayan or Tigray genocide to kind of reinforce that whole narrative. But it's not all about Tigrayans. It's not.
Absolutely. The rebel groups are not representing the entire region, and there are so many proud Tigrayan that will believe that with one Ethiopia and trying to live peacefully. That is true. So after the capture of Desi and Kambolcha, as we know, the current government announced a state of emergency in there, and the international, it looks like that the international community and the mainstream medias misinterpreted this state of emergency. And what do you tell us about that?
Not to go off script, but there's been a big problem over the past 10 to 15 years in terms of journalism and this clickbait, if it bleeds, it leads type of mentality and sensationalism. And that is in addition to those actors who are either in Getachew Reda's pocket or who are part of a mechanism that wants to see regime change. As a student, you know, I studied history. My family is a military family, et cetera, so forth. I've been talking to my friends about the Tet Offensive and a city called Hue. And when you have people who are loyal or sympathetic to the rebel group, who are armed and have the potential to be heavily armed, and who are living all throughout the city in these sleeper cells, or all throughout the country in these sleeper cells, you have to take action. You know, you wake up and you find out that you have people in the line. You have, you know, to use a term that, you know, enemy in the line. You know, your line is compromised because you have people in your rear guard, which is the worst position for a military leader to be in tactically, to have his enemy not just in front of him, but behind him in his safe areas. So, you know, the West has just basically completely like set a double standard. It's just like, this is standard military operation, you know? And when it comes to Ethiopia trying to defend itself, the West is like, oh, all of that history and all of those concepts go out the window because this is Ethiopian and they have all of this rhetoric about Abiy and what have you. But the point is, it would make no sense for you to do anything other if you were finding caches of weapons in Addis Ababa months ago. And I think people who live in Addis or who know the situation on the ground know exactly what I'm talking about. You know, news reports all the time, you know, boxes of weapons found here at this hotel, boxes of weapons found at that hotel, et cetera, et cetera. And then we're not talking about people's homes, you know? So yeah, it makes total sense to me, you know, especially with what happened in Dessie, with sleepers coming out and basically ambushing Amhara in the streets, or ambushing the ENDF, because from one report I read, they had put on ENDF uniforms and the ENDF thought they were getting reinforcements, but they were getting ambushed. So it makes total sense to me. And actually, one of the things that, and I'll call Jeff out on this, one of the things that I really wish Jeff had done when he was in Addis was engage the Tigrayan activist group who...
Are you still
one
there?
Activist, I'm still here.
Okay,
I'm still
go
here.
ahead.
Yeah. And so one activist was even quoted as saying, if I got arrested during the course of a search, I would understand why, because of the environment that these people have created for all of us in Ethiopia.
Interesting. Let me take you to here now. Recently, one of the general who's in charge of the command post for East African, General Zan, I believe, gave this note to BBC. Let's take a look at it and discuss about it.
Okay.
May make it decide to withdraw forces from Somalia. Now you have 5 African Union countries that are also affected, and Somalia. You have the potential for violent extremist organizations to have greater activity there. We also see enduring conflicts or points of tension. The border conflict between Sudan and Ethiopia, that risks of that turning, or perhaps with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam with the GERD, that it would change the calculus there. There's a risk that other countries may look at Ethiopia's internal focus as an opportunity to take something, whether it be a military action or stronger political action, when Ethiopia is not credibly able to either continue operations or negotiation.
In the event Addis Ababa falls, what role can this base take? What role can the U.S. military take to deal with the impact of that fall?
So a primary role for our command here is to be able to respond to crisis, and in particular to respond to crises that are associated with U.S. diplomatic missions across Africa, but in particular in East Africa. We have done an incredible amount of planning and preparation to be able to respond, to assist in evacuation, to reinforce an embassy, to do a larger scale evacuation if necessary, both for U.S. personnel, U.S. citizens or dual citizens, or those from other countries. The East African Response Force, the only U.S. crisis response force that is located on the continent of Africa is part of our command and located here. So we bring capabilities together from each of our joint services and allies and partners to any sort of crisis. And Ethiopia is obviously very concerning for us.
So, the response to this crisis, if these crises are escalated, is this to believe, I mean, what do you think? Is this to help and support the people of Ethiopia and the government, or support the rebels, or what do you think all about this plan without having the facts on the ground? Are we going to see another Iraq, and are we going to see another Libya or Afghanistan? Your opinion, please.
Okay, I'm just still having a reaction to that video. Everything I've seen, especially this piece and the op-eds by two American publications that came out over the weekend or on Friday, they speak of nothing but further what we call psyops geared towards regime change. I have no affiliation with the Ethiopian government. I'm not paid by anybody. This is just me, from Baltimore City, who basically went to Ethiopia to write a book on Christianity years ago and ended up falling in love with the country. This has nothing to do with anything but the truth. And this just speaks of, the modern day Patrice Lumumba style regime change and character assassination, ultimate assassination, not trying to put anything in anybody's head. But this is about regime change. All I hear when I hear that is, okay, it just makes my blood boil a little bit. If Ethiopia, if the capital falls, who's telling you that? Who is telling you that if the capital falls? So obviously you are engaging the rebels, the OLF and the TPLF more than you're engaging the Ethiopian government. Secondly, if you have such massive intelligence infrastructure just across the border in Djibouti, why are you saying that? And wouldn't it be your duty to basically alert your original ally, the Ethiopian government, if you had intel on something happening or potentially happening, right? There's some other things that just scream of, straight propaganda. And I keep going back to that because of information that was brought to me by a whistleblower about the information network that was set up by Getachew Reda and Simone Barakat many years ago. And when I look at the way propaganda is disseminated now, I look at that original network that they set up. I believe it was 2014 when they formed this network and series, this layers of propaganda that started with the big 25 NGOs and humanitarian organizations, to the extent where Getachew Reda told them who to hire and how much to pay. So the information just basically comes out of this network and is fed to people, and it reaches the halls of Congress, it reaches 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and beyond. And to me, I'm just like, Ethiopia just needs to be left alone. The elephant in the room to me as a journalist is the fact that they have basically swept the Northern Command attacks in my cadre under the rug. They are not holding the TPLF accountable for killing what conservative estimates say is a total of 7,600 people in the first week of this war that were basically due to the attack on the Northern Command and the genocide in my cadre. I think we just need to step it up and call it what it was. And it was all a part of the same military operation. There is no separation between my cadre and the Northern Command attacks on the 5 bases. There's no separation. It was all part of the same move to take over the country. And the fact that the US is endorsing people who basically did that and decided to do that and go against a sovereign government, it speaks volumes to me.
Let me take you back again to your trip. What did you heard and what can you tell us about the attack that was taking place in November on the Ethiopian command post attack by the rebels group?
Okay, what I heard was that starting on the night of November 3rd, TPLF commandos and TPLF loyalists began to attack members of the Northern Command in their sleep or unawares at 5 different bases, Northern Command in Mekelle, all the way down to Dansha, and a few other bases. These attacks were the 3rd and the 4th. They coincided with the execution of day laborers that started in Maikadra as early as, I want to say, the 4th. As these attacks took place, activists around the world, in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere, began to tweet Tigray genocide. So you have a calculated, well-organized physical attack, PSYOPs campaign, and genocide all rolled up into one. And so basically everybody is complicit for everything. So to the activist who is in Sweden, who is tweeting Tigray genocide on November 4th, is just as guilty as the Samri who went to Sudan to hide out after they killed people in Maikadra. So it wasn't, these were not separate incidences. These were not separate operations. Interviews that I conducted in Maikadra and Humera revealed that the planning for these things were weeks in advance, noticeably. Day laborers stopped getting paid. Restrictions on residents with Amhara IDs became harsher for people trying to go in and out of Maikadra, and eventually Amhara could not leave Maikadra on the days before the massacre. Some of the day laborers that I spoke to, they stopped receiving their pay 10 days before the killing started in Maikadra. These farms, as I stated before, and I think as most of you know, most of your viewers would know, were owned by TPLF generals, retired TPLF generals who were in the ENDF. So they had, sorry.
Are you there? Okay.
You still there?
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. They had extreme information. Jesus, we still there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here listening.
Okay, sorry. So they had the information and they were able to coordinate all of these operations, you know, as former military members. There is, if you don't mind me telling, there is the story about the group of soldiers, the retired soldiers who lived in a region or a place called Division. And these are retired older soldiers, some who had been wounded in battle, some who were just, how can I call it, wounded, incapacitated soldiers, some of them. They participated in the attacks as well, and they were closer to the base at Dansha. And they had been stockpiling weapons at their, I'll call it a retirement home, for some period of time before the attack started. When you pass through the road to go to Maikadra and Humera, you pass by several tanks that had been stolen by the TPLF and were used to attack some of these bases. I find it interesting that none of my media colleagues who have been past these tanks that were stolen by the TPLF have ever brought these stories out about the fact that these tanks were being used to attack the bases that were nearby. So it was a very sophisticated attack. I think that the fact that one half of the media world has intentionally swept it under the rug, which also effectively sweeps Maikadra under the rug, and the other half just didn't give due diligence to investigate the situation, I think it speaks volumes. It speaks volumes. Anybody from this day forward who says the conflict started when Abiy went to attack the TPLF to remove them from the government is basically complicit in this. They're complicit in the propaganda, the lies. They're complicit in this war on Ethiopia, in my opinion.
Thank you. Let me take you there to the other side of my question now. It's the history telling us Ethiopia helped most African nations at the time of their need. And this time when Ethiopia going through this crisis or this unrest, most African nations become quiet. So your thought about that, what do you tell us?
Well, I'll give you a personal experience. I have a friend from South Africa who is well placed in a major network, and she still to this day is not clear on the details. When I speak to my other friends in South Africa, they're just like, they're completely unaware of what's happening, or they side with the TPLF because the TPLF has been described as this valiant rebel group who's fighting for their freedom. You know, never mind that they basically killed several thousand people in the first week of November, right? In their attempts to overthrow the Ethiopian government. That little detail never comes out. So it's, you know, the misinformation campaign was brilliant. We lost. The Ethiopian government lost that campaign because they weren't expecting to fight that campaign. So African nations are playing catch up with the facts. And a lot of times when you're playing catch up with the facts, what happens is, okay, so you're trying to rewrite the story. You're trying to rewrite the narrative. And then because of, you know, this whole notion of, please help me with her name, the other Nobel Prize winner who is in Myanmar, Anna, you know I'm talking about, basically, yeah. the leader in Myanmar. Because of her legacy and the things that have happened there, people are just making it like, oh, Abiy's doing the same thing. He won a Nobel Peace Prize, and then he just decided to become an authoritarian dictator and run roughshod over the Tigrayans. And that's not true. But if you're trying to say that now, then people look at you like, you know, oh, well, you're biased. You know, when I was in Mekelle talking to a group of Western journalists who had come in to tell the story, now that we had access to Mekelle and Tigray, they came in already informed from the TPLF standpoint. And that was before their TPLF fixers began to guide them around and show them what they wanted to see and teach them the revised history of Ethiopia. So it's been about the narrative and the media narrative and just how much people actually know. People don't know the history of Walkite. One of the same journalists that was in that group that I was talking to was like, you know, oh, Abiy he's losing control. I don't know what he's doing. He just gave Walkite back to the Amhara. And that was traditionally, you know, that belonged to the Tigrayan people. And I tried to tell him, I said, do you know the history of Walkite? I said, have you been to my Kadra? He said, I'll get there. He didn't really care about going. He didn't care about knowing it. And, you know, Walkite, I'm pretty sure there's people on this in your viewing audience who can tell you about how Walkite has been separate from Tigray in a different region, a part of North Gondar, for almost 1,000 years. So, you know, it's just information. It's information. And I think that the more that they begin to know, and then the more that they see that the U.S. and the West is taking this approach and this stance towards Ethiopia, I think that some will wake up. But as you just saw with the case of Zambia, money speaks volumes. So.
Very true. Let me bring you back here in the U.S. now. Because of all what we have discussed now, the Ethiopian American community is very disappointed with by the current administration here in the U.S. And they start changing their political views and also start voting to Republicans. As a black man, your take on that, what do you tell us?
I was in Kansas City earlier this week covering the opening days of the Cameron Lamb trial. Cameron Lamb was an unarmed black man who was killed sitting in his own backyard in his own truck by 2 plainclothes detectives from the Kansas City Police Department. As a black man raising a black son, I am concerned about what that means. What does it mean to, go completely red? Because there are some Republicans who are people who are completely straight up human beings. I've engaged some of them on Capitol Hill in the course of a day's work. You walk by them, you see them, you talk to them and you listen to them talk. There are some Republicans who are a bit more radical and some who are extremist and et cetera, so forth, that represent values that we all don't hold. It's dangerous. But, and just to be completely frank, looking at the photos that I've seen from this war for the past year, from Ataye to Mexico, Benishangul Gooms to, everywhere, where I've just happened to see dead children, my son's age, who are basically like my son, because my son is Amhara, it sticks with you. And I completely understand it. The thing to me that makes me just question anything American is the fact that I know that Tony Blinken, Samantha Power, all of these people on these intelligence committees and foreign affairs committees, they've seen the same photos. They may not have seen all the dead children from Ataye, but they've seen these photos of dead Amhara children and dead Amhara women. And their reaction is to support the TPLF. So I don't blame the Ethiopian American community. I quite frankly don't blame the African community if they decided to switch wholesale Republican. Yes, it will bite us in the butt. Yes, it will do great harm to us. But I think those of us who have been traumatized for the past year because of this war, and then to be triply traumatized and gaslit by the American political establishment for backing terrorists, I don't think you have to be in those shoes. You have to live in those shoes.
Well, Mr. Jamal, because of the limited time that we have to wrap up our program. But before I do that, if you have any message to the people of Ethiopia and the world, please go ahead and let's finish our conversation.
Okay, well, I would just encourage our diaspora community to find secure, honest channels through which we can support the IDPs in Amhara and Afar. And really, let's get to solving some of these issues hands-on. It's time to basically make the sacrifices. If we have to plan ourselves there to make sure aid is being distributed, clothes and whatever materials are being distributed. If somebody needs to be there and just set up camp for 3 or 4 weeks, then these are the kind of sacrifices that need to be made. I would advise my Tigrayan brothers and sisters to really just deal with this conflict as it is, recognize yourselves as Ethiopians, and just please don't let these seeds of ethnic division continue to fester and start fires that will basically consume us all. And Ethiopia in general, hang tight, stand for the truth, because, we're fresh out of Afghanistan. And I don't think certain people, patriots in this country, are going to allow us to walk into confronting and assaulting one of the first, if not the first Christian nation on the planet over a bunch of propaganda and just lies. So that's what I can say as coherently as I can say it.
Mr. Jamal, thank you for your time again, and it's a pleasure having you on the Gera Show. I hope to meet you again on a different topic.
Me too. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Have a great Sunday, sir.
You too.
ተመልካቾቻችን እስካሁን ስትከታተሉ የቆያችሁት ከጋዜጠኛና ፎቶግራፈር ሚስተር ጀማል ካውንተስ ጋር ያደረኩትን ውይይት ነበር። ውይይታችን በእንግሊዝኛ ነበር። ሁላችሁም በጣም ጥሩ ጊዜ እንዳሳልፋችሁ የተማመንኩኝ። አሁንም በድጋሚ ለኛ አንዳንድ መልእክቶችን ማድረስ የምትፈልጉ በድረገጽ አድራሻችን www.dtv-tv.com ውስጥ በመግባት ወይም ደግሞ ጌራ ሾውን ፈልጎ ላይክ በማድረግና ቤተሰብ በመሆን እንዲሁም ከስክሪናችን ስር በመታየት ዩቲዩብ ቻናላችንን ሰብስክራይብ እና ላይክ በማድረግ ልታደርሱልን ትችላላችሁ ፕሮግራማችንን እስካሁን ስለተከታተላችሁን ከልብ እናመሰግናለን መልካም ቆይታ